Okay, well, welcome everybody. Happy Friday. Thanks for being here. We are recording, so if for any reason you don't want to be recorded, feel free to turn your video off, and we'll be sure to send the link to everybody at the end if you have to jump off early so you don't have to miss anything. I'm Amy Foster. I'm the CEO of the HLA, and we are really excited to bring this presentation to board members and providers and others today. HMIS is a topic that has come up in many board meetings recently, and we felt like it was time that we do a refresher. Some of you may have had an introduction to HMIS back when the Homeless Leadership Alliance took over, being the HMIS lead agency. But it comes up in almost every topic, the importance of our data and all the various ways that the HMIS system can benefit not only us as a community, but also providers and agencies. So we thought it would be a good time to reintroduce the topic and also spend plenty of time for you to ask any questions that you may have. This is not intended to be an HMIS new participant training. If you need that, Ganael is your point person and will happily walk you through this. But this particular presentation, we hope, gives board members and leaders, as well as others, kind of an overview of the purpose of the system and some of the primary components, as well as the ways that you can make it most beneficial and answer any questions you may have. So you will get some live screen later today and some screenshots so you can see when people talk about entering into HMIS, what that actually means. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our HMIS team. And thanks again for being with us today.
Thanks, Amy. So my name is Cindy Kazowich, and I want to welcome you all to our HMIS 101. We're really excited to be here today, and we're really grateful that you were able to join us. I want to introduce the rest of the staff. So again, my name is Cindy Kazowich, and I'm the HMIS director.
Good morning, everyone. I am Brian Leapley. I am the Pinellas HMIS System Administrator.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ganael, and I am the HMIS Training and Support Coordinator.
And we want to introduce you to our new staff team member. And Angela, why don't you say hello?
Hey, everyone. I am Angela Milton. I am your brand spanking new data and support specialist.
And we're excited to have Angela on board. This is her 4th day, and we've gotten through a couple hiccups, so we're excited to get her started, and she's a great asset to our team. As you know, we're meeting today to go over HMIS 101 in regards to what it means, what it is. Ganael is going to give you a little tutorial. You should have the agenda. And a lot of people want to know, what is HMIS? So in 2017, what was the Homeless Leadership Board took lead agency over the Homeless Management Information System, the HMIS system, and they named, the COC named it the Pinellas HMIS. So that is what we are called. And a lot of folks apparently are somewhat confused on our role. We are actually a team members of the Homeless Leadership Alliance of Pinellas, and we are just a separate department that deals specifically with HMIS, and we also assist in other things. So what is HMIS? HMIS is the Homeless Management Information System. It's just an acronym, and it's used to collect data so that people don't have to share their story more than once. So it's for folks that are either homeless, which means that they're maybe in a place not meant for habitation, or at imminent risk where they're going to be maybe homeless in 14 days to try to prevent that from happening. We collect this data in the software. It's a website-based software program, and we collect the data, and Brian is our whiz at reporting. And it goes into what's called WellSky Community Services. That's just the vendor for Service Point and what will be called Unit Manager instead of Shelter Point. And they do about 60% of the COC HMIS databases for across the country. So they're pretty well known, and we use it along with about 60%. It may be a little bit less now, I'm not sure, but most people use it. So what is homelessness? I'm sure that you are already aware that it means that, anyone who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, which means basically that they are in a place not meant for habitation. And what is imminent risk of homelessness? It's just where they may lose their primary nighttime residence and within 14 days. So basically, we enter all of this data into the system. They're not considered homeless if they're at imminent risk of homelessness, but we still do collect that data, and we do some reporting on that for agencies. So keep that in mind. And why is HMIS used? So HMIS is used because a lot of HUD requires a lot of data to be reported to them. So anyone who's funded by HUD needs to enter into our system. It's used to by all projects that target services to persons experiencing homelessness and to measure the project performance and benchmarking of the national effort to end homelessness. So our data goes to HUD. And Brian usually is the person that generates the report and submits it for the COC. With that, I'm going to hand this over, and I'm going to man the chat. So if anyone comes up with any questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat feature, and we'll be able to answer your questions at the end of the show.
All right, so Cindy did a great introduction to HMIS, and so I want to get into some of the additional details, as HMIS is a national database, national concept, not specifically Pinellas HMIS. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the funders that do require HMIS use and what that means. So like Cindy said, we do see federal partners that do require HMIS fund or HMIS participation. And some of those examples are HUD, the VA, and Health and Human Services. But then outside of those federal partners, we also are starting to see it trickle down to some of the lower levels at the state and then local levels as well. The original intent for HMIS was that these federal funded programs and projects needed somewhere to enter their data, and the federal partners, primarily driven by HUD and mandated by Congress, wanted to see this being done in a consistent manner. And so that's where HMIS really started. So it's really designed for those federal programs that require the HMIS data use. But again, we're starting to see that trickle down. And so when we talk about state funding that requires HMIS use, we're not necessarily talking about the federal grants that pass through the state. So grants like the Emergency Solutions Grant or the COC funding that comes from HUD that's allocated through the NOFA, those are still falling under those federal funders. But when we look at other things that DCF provides in the state of Florida for grants that they are administering that are coming from Florida funds that are requiring that use, that's what we're looking at. So if a federal grant is passing through someone else to that service project, they're still going to be required to do it based on what those HUD requirements are. But we're starting to see more use being done at the state and local level from cities and counties receiving either additional funding from the federal government that doesn't normally require HMIS entry, or from their own private allocations that they are doing with their local funds where they want to see this information being used. This is a trend that we are seeing across the country. HMIS use is really growing in terms of how much it's being used by non-federal programs. And so that's actually a really good thing because it is a centralized database. And so it gets that information into kind of a collective system where we can really look at the system's performance and health across the COC. what it means when we have a federal funder or another funder that is requiring that HMIS use is that this is where we really see the information for what types of data are being collected, how it's being collected, and how it's being reported out. So in the case of the federal funders, if they require HMIS data entry as part of their grant, they actually develop a very specific workflow and reporting process that our HMIS vendor, WellSky, pushes out for those projects to use in HMIS. We set it up locally. We can make changes to it, but we have to still collect that base level of information. So these funders are really what drives the workflows, the reporting requirements, what the outcomes may be. It's not something that is necessarily controlled by a local HMIS implementation. It's really done and driven by those funders. Outside of the kind of government-based funders, we're also seeing other private funders that are starting to actually ask for HMIS use. And so we are seeing that grow, again, overall from the federal level down to the local level. One of the major drivers for HMIS, as far as that shared database goes, is that HUD is looking for system level reporting on a COC's performance and progress towards ending homelessness. And you can't really do that from 30 or 40 isolated databases across a community. You really need a centralized system where you can report on all of the relevant program participants that are entering their data. And so along with HMIS being that shared system, we also do a lot of reporting to HUD directly from our local data. So HUD has 4 major system reports that are required each year. So the new one is the Longitudinal System Analysis Report, or LSA. This launched in 2018. We just submitted both 2019 and 2020 simultaneously. 2019 was delayed due to the pandemic. This is a very large 3-year report. It's a direct export from HMIS to a HUD repository where HUD does the data quality checks and runs all of the outcomes and performance measures. Like I said, it's a very large report, but it is also a very useful report, and it's undergoing a lot of revisions to use that data to create tools that local COCs can use for both measuring outcomes and planning purposes, but it's still really in early development as far as those tools go. The system performance measures are similar to the LSA. It's also an annual report that pulls 1 year of data. The LSA pulls 3, the system performance measures pull 1, but what they measure internally are very similar. They both look at a lot of system level performance outcomes. So how long are people homeless? How often are we seeing individuals and households returning to homelessness after being placed into permanent housing? Where are they being served? Are they being served in emergency shelter? Are they being served in shelter and transitional housing? We see this kind of transition in the data primarily with the LSA. And both of those reports, like I said, they do things very similarly, but they also are different in how they measure some. So HUD is not replicating the same work. It's trying to look at different ways of measuring data to try to get that fuller picture of what is actually going on. Then we have the housing inventory count. This one's pretty basic. It's really a snapshot that coincides with the point in time count of what the bed counts and shelter capacity is from emergency shelter up to permanent supportive housing, and includes rapid rehousing across the COC. So it's done at a point in time. It's not a running count throughout the year, but it is designed to coincide with the point in time. And then the point in time is probably one of the best known, just because we do the massive unsheltered street count usually every year. And the point in time is, again, a snapshot in time of the homeless population in a COC. Now, when you look at the research and the information on it, it's well acknowledged that the point in time is not a great tool for research because it is only a snapshot, a single day out of 365. But the point in time count is the only time that every community across the country is actually doing a concerted effort to count all of their unsheltered homeless people, at the same time. So you're trying to prevent that deduplication across counties, across cities. So it is still very useful. And then all 4 of these reports together are actually a part of the annual homeless assessment report that HUD delivers to the US Congress every year. So all of the data that we submit goes through a review process, and HUD determines whether or not our data is usable. And if so, they work on incorporating whatever they want from that information to that report to Congress. So all of this information goes to Congress, where Congress can use it for determining allocation for funding and for resources. But then it also comes into our own local NOFA process with HUD, where we are looking to get HUD funding for projects. And our performance there, our progress towards ending homelessness, how well we are performing as a system, is actually part of that determination for how much money we are allocated from HUD. So these are very important reports that really do a lot for the system. These aren't the only reports. There are, for those HUD-funded projects, there are some project level reports that I'll talk about a little later, but those could theoretically be run from an external database. So domestic violence providers can't enter into HMIS. And so they have to have a comparable database if they get federal funding to report out on kind of these standard reporting metrics. But the early intent for HMIS is really about this system level use. And so as we see more non-federal funded programs entering into HMIS or requiring that use, it expands how much we know. So getting as many of the shelter providers in the community into our system gives us a better idea of what's happening there. So that participation is really important when it comes to being able to tell that full picture of how our system is performing. So on that, I wanted to talk a little bit about Pinellas HMIS itself and wanted to look at what we have in our system. So, we talk about program participation and agency participation and the scope of participation across the county in HMIS. And we really have a really good level of participation. We have 36 partner agencies across the county, and some of them do get federal funding and are required to enter. Others get some local or county or state funding that require them to enter. And then we have some that choose to enter willingly because they understand the importance of it. And we're grateful for all of our participant agencies because, again, the more information we have, the better the story we can tell about who's being served and how our system is performing. So again, we have those 36 partner agencies, but each partner agency may have a range of projects under that tree that they have to enter data into. So it's not just we have 36 projects, all this data is pulled together. Agencies actually usually have a number of different projects that are dictated by their reporting needs, their grants, or their funders. The basic rule of thumb is that if you have 2 different fundings, whether it's ESG from the county and ESG from a city, or if you have the ESG funding and the supportive services for veteran families, if you have 2 different funding streams, you need 2 different projects. So you can separate out that data and report accurately on who is being served under which funding. So as we see this growth in participation and funding, it means more projects for agencies to use. So we have 148 projects that are actively entering data into HMIS. A project could be anything from a drop-in center for basic services. It could be an emergency shelter. It could be a rapid rehousing project connected to any funding stream. It could be a permanent supportive housing project. So it's a wide range of different services that are captured under these projects. And on average, you can see that we see a little over 4 projects per agency, again, when we look on average across the system. But that's not always the full picture. So we do have a few agencies that have significantly more than that. So 6 of our partner agencies actually have more than 10 projects each. These are 10 separate projects that they have to enter their data into, follow a workflow for each one. They might be very similar. They may have 2 rapid rehousing projects funded by different grants. So they just have to follow the same basic workflow, but just make sure they are enrolling clients in the correct projects. And then we have our 3 largest agencies that have more than 20 separate projects in HMIS that they're actively entering data into. And so as we see that growth, this adds to the workload, the need for reconciliation and data quality for these agencies, because they are entering a lot of different people into different projects and trying to keep all of that straight. And so we really try to provide as much assistance as possible to make sure that they know which project to enter into, and they can do that successfully without having to go back and do a lot of data cleanup. When a project ends, the data remains in HMIS, it doesn't disappear, so we can still report on it. We can get their information out if they need it. It doesn't disappear from our system for reporting purposes, but they wouldn't be counted in our active projects. So overall, we have closer to 250 or 300 projects that have been entering data into the entire lifespan of HMIS in Pinellas County. We've also seen a large growth in that participation. As I mentioned before, we're seeing it from a lot of different sources. Right now, we're seeing a big growth primarily from the ESG CV funding, which is the COVID funding from the federal government. We're seeing large influxes of that, but we're also seeing other funding that may be connected to either the pandemic response or just new projects, new ideas that are coming in. And so since March, since essentially the beginning of the pandemic, we have added 43 active projects to HMIS that are collecting data across a number of different agencies and funding streams and types of services. And so as we see that growth, again, that means more work for those member agencies. Data entry could become more difficult. So we really have seen this growth, but again, the more growth we see, the better our picture is when it comes to data across the system. And we have had some new agencies in the process of joining, which is really great, because new agencies means new resources, new information, new sources of data, and again, that fuller picture, which is really what HMIS is trying to get to. So the one thing I wanted to add as well is this terminology issue. HMIS, like a lot of other databases or just systems, uses a lot of terminology and language and acronyms that are specific to it, which is very, very often unfortunate, because it really does, it can create confusion, especially if we're talking to newer agencies. They use terms, we're trying to use terms. And so it's finding that middle ground. So we wanted to just show what that means in terms of HMIS. And so one of the major problem areas with HMIS language is the project or program distinction, because many times people will talk about a program as my agency has a rapid rehousing program, or my agency has an emergency shelter program. In HMIS terms, a program is a specific funding source. So the COC funding from HUD, the supportive services for veteran families, the emergency solutions grant, all of those would be considered programs. The project is that distinct unit that data is entered into in HMIS by that agency. And so a project could be a wide range of things. It could be a physical site. So if you have a drop-in center for services or a shelter, that could be a project. But otherwise, a project could be something like rapid rehousing for ESG or rapid rehousing for SSVF. So projects can have different sources. It could be a funding stream that they are operating under, or it could be a physical site. But there is a distinction there, because program refers to that specific funding stream and project refers to that element set up in HMIS. And so we do try as much as we can when we set up projects to name each project in a way that is going to help both the end users entering the data, the managers and supervisors at that agency, and also us at HMIS understand what the project is, what the workflow needs to be, what data needs to be collected, what their reporting requirements are. So we really try to do things like use the funding source and the project name. If they have a specific name for that project, we'll try to incorporate that, just to try to keep things straight. So we make sure when we're looking at it that we try to reduce as much confusion as possible. And with that, I will turn this over to Ganael.
Hey, Brian, can I ask a follow-up question about project or program?
Yes.
So if I'm an agency and I have a rapid rehousing program, for example, I can't, just have XYZ agency rapid rehousing set up as a workflow. It would have to be City of St. Pete Social Action Funding rapid rehousing, county rapid rehousing, ESGCV rapid rehousing. So even if as an organization, you treat it as all the same and just determine funding source in HMIS, it has to have separate workflows.
Yes, that's correct. So with the different funding streams, a lot of them may use the same basic workflow, but a lot of it really comes down to the reporting requirements. And for something like ESG, we have regular ESG and we also have ESG-CV. And then of course we have ESG-CV from DCF, from the county, from cities. So all of that needs to be separated out because all of those are getting reported back based specifically on the clients served under that funding stream and have to be reported back in a specific way. So for the most part, if you have multiple funding streams, you can't combine them into a single project. There are very limited exceptions. The best one I can provide is with the Emergency Solutions Grant, it is possible to supplement shelter services with that. And because of the nature of shelter, HUD does not expect a separate ESG shelter to be created to track the handful of clients served under that. It's allowed to be reported in the same pool. So the funders may allow it, but it is very limited in terms of the situations where that would come up. So the basic rule of thumb is, yes, if you have separate funding streams for the same project type, rapid rehousing is a great example, they would need to be split out. So when you report back to that funder, this is how many people we served, you are reporting back just on those served in that project. So blending funding is something that is generally not something that would be set up in HMIS because it does make reporting very difficult. And in some instances, it will not report correctly to the funder. So generally it always needs to be split out into separate projects.
All right, great. Thank you, Brian. So in accordance with all of our growth, especially with all the new projects, what we're also seeing is an influx in, end users, agency admins from new agencies. So since October 2020 to April of this year, we've conducted about 221 trainings ranging anywhere from new user trainings, annual refreshers in general about a particular topic in HMIS that they might be struggling with, whether it's households, income, how to create one, how to modify one, even report trainings, coordinated entry trainings. So we have 510 end users and 44 agency administrators. So report requests are custom requests needed when existing reports don't fulfill a certain need. And in order to make it a lot easier, so to gather all the necessary information to avoid a little bit of back and forth, a report request form was created just so that we can gather all that information from the beginning, avoiding kind of the back and forth of asking questions and trying to specify things. So the report request makes that process very seamless. And since October 1, 2020, we've had about 73 report requests. Now, Pinellas HMIS typically receives about 105 tickets a month on average. Could be anything from data corrections, so social security updates, date of birth updates, name changes, things like that. We also get quite a few training requests and technical assistance if any numbers on their APRs are looking a little off or they're getting some errors and they're not quite sure how to fix that. We'll get a help desk ticket for it. And that's usually where we tend to provide a technical assistance session. So as mentioned before, the help desk, I'm sorry. So this is what our help desk looks like. Now it has a lot of different very cool features. On the top right, there's a section where you can submit a request. So this is where you can submit a ticket to us. It also has a section for client point guides, policies and forms. We also have materials from our previous quarterly meetings with agency administrators, and we tend to post that on our help desk as well. That way they can always go back and refer to that information later. And over here, we have a little bit of information about why we use the help desk. So as mentioned before, we have a lot of different sections on our help desk, kind of like a self-serving help desk, if you will, where you're able to access all of our forms or guides. And we also have others similar helpful documentation there. We have some videos for reporting, the reports needed for the data certification on a monthly basis. Those recordings are available on our help desk, and it goes through pretty much how to run the report, how to troubleshoot it, what certain errors mean. And usually after seeing that video, it tends to help to try and figure out what an error means in HMIS. And if they still can't figure out, that's when we would get a help desk ticket highlighting what they tried and what is not working for them. So one of the greatest features of our help desk is that it sends out an email to all Pinellas HMIS staff. So that way, if any staff is unavailable for any reason, like they're in a meeting or PTO or whatever it is, at least all other staff members still get that ticket. So that person's not waiting to get an answer because the person's not available. And it also lets users track what responses they get. So the tickets, if we ever need to make an update on it, it will automatically notify the requesters of the status of that ticket. And with that, I will pass that on over to Brian.
Okay, so we've done a little bit of an overview of HMIS and Pinellas HMIS itself. And so we wanted to talk a little bit more about what is in HMIS as far as data, the tools, reporting. So we're going to start looking at some of the data and metrics that are commonly used in HMIS. And so the first one, this is kind of the foundational data point for basically all of our reporting, both locally and all of the federal reporting, is something called an entry exit. And the best way to think of an entry exit is that it's a set of dates, a start date and an end date, or an entry date and an exit date. And this really tracks the enrollment for a client in a project. This is, again, the kind of the underlying data element for basically all reports. Any federal workflow requires the use of entry exits. And generally, this is what we recommend for all providers that are using HMIS. The only real exception to that would be something like a soup kitchen or a service drop-in center, where whenever that person shows up, you'll provide them that service, but you don't necessarily know how long they are going to be accessing those services. So soup kitchens tend to provide a lot of services in bulk, and they'll enter those services in bulk, but they don't necessarily have time to create all of these entry exits for all of those people being served. But everything from shelter, street outreach, rapid rehousing, up to permanent supportive housing uses entry exits, because again, it gives us that definitive enrollment date and then that eventual discharge date. An entry exit could be any length. So you could provide one-time financial assistance and you do a same day entry exit. That's perfectly all right. Or you could have that emergency or that permanent supportive housing project and we have some that have been participating in HMIS since 2006-07 and have the same clients enrolled in those projects for years. So there is no specific set for how long an entry exit lasts. It's just once they are no longer receiving those services, you would discharge them both from your project and then also from the project in the database. The entry exit, the best way to think about it is essentially a bracket that surrounds a client's data while they are connected with the program. And it's this set of data that really is the basis for most of our reporting. So understanding entry exits goes a long way to understanding what we're reporting, where it's coming from, and the different things that we can do with data in HMIS. The existence of an entry exit is usually the primary determinant of whether or not a client shows up in a report. So if a client's missing an entry exit, they're probably not going to show up in a federal report or a lot of local reporting, unless it is a soup kitchen or a service center that does not use them. So that entry exit is crucial. That's also where data is collected and updated for a client record. And again, it doesn't necessarily state that this is what services a client is receiving. This is a client that is enrolled in that project. We'll talk about services a little later, which captures the specificity of what's being provided. But here you can see what the entry exit looks like. So you have the entry date and the exit date, which are the required parts of it. But then there's the interim update that can be done in the middle of the entry and the exit if the client situation changes while they are enrolled. It's not required for all project types or funding streams. There are some that do require annual updates if someone is enrolled for more than a year, but it is a major thing that we do stress if a client situation changes during enrollment, because again, it gives us additional data to use. The best way to think about how the entry date, the update, and the exit date play into reporting is that each one of these creates a snapshot in time of the client's information that was entered in the system as of that date. So when we do our intake, we have a snapshot of all of their data elements. We know what their status was there. We have the same thing at the point of exit. If their situation changes during, the best way to capture that so we can then report on it is by doing an update. So if they increase income or they gain health insurance or they gain some other non-cash benefit, you'd be able to capture that information and track it with that interim update. The one area where that is required is with the federal funded projects through the COC with that annual update, which is something that would be collected on the anniversary of their initial intake. And again, all that does is it creates that data point that we can use for reporting purposes, and it helps us track changes over time. So some projects may not be able to use it because people don't stay in the program long enough for changes to occur, or they may not use it because there were no changes for that client. So it is something we stress. It is something that is definitely very useful if there are changes in the client situation, but it's not something that is required of all projects to use. So here we have some of the common data elements that are essentially collected by all participating HMIS projects. These are drawn from the HUD Data Standards Manual, which is the data standards published by HUD in collaboration with the other federal partners like the VA and Health and Human Services. These are updated. There's a major update every 2 years. We will be getting one this year. Otherwise, every year on October 1st, they will update if there are some slight changes. It may be some slight wording changes, or it may actually be a funder wants to add a new question. But every 2 years, we do usually get some larger changes. So these come from those HUD standards. These are the universal data elements because, again, they are collected by generally all HMIS participants. And this really gives us kind of the basics of who is being served. So we have our demographic information. Most of this is like the name, social, date of birth. Those are generally collected when the record is created and they never have to be touched again. But occasionally we'll get an incorrect date of birth, or maybe something wasn't answered earlier on. And so those can be updated at a later point. So they're not set in stone. After the demographics, we also get some of the basic outcomes and basic measures, and then also the homeless status questions. So with our outcomes, we have our project start date and our project exit date, and also our exit destination. in the data elements. And so we can look at when someone was enrolled, when they left, what their exit destination was. We also have, again, the homeless history, which you can see on this slide. Things like the prior living situation, how long were they in that situation, their approximate date that homelessness started, the number of times in total months. These all play into whether or not a client is considered to be chronically homeless. So a lot of this information here is really the backbone of a lot of the reporting that is done, both locally and to the federal partners. It's not always the most complex information, but it really does tell us a lot. So when you look at something like race and ethnicity, HUD is putting a lot of focus on equity issues. And so we get some of that information here. We'd have our exit date and our entry date, so we can look at who's being served, how long are they being served, their exit destination, when they leave, where are they going. So just these basic elements really tell us a lot about what is actually happening in our system. In this snapshot, this is a kind of a copy of the basic intake that you will see. A little later, Ganael is going to be doing a demo in our training site that will show some of this a little easier. So if you can't see this very well, you'll get a copy of this and you'll be able to look at that information a little more closely. But Ganael will also be showing what that actually looks like to enter the information. But you can see that it tracks the information. HMIS does a great job of maintaining a record of the information collected. So like Cindy had mentioned before, once a client shares that information, this would be here for the next person that is doing an intake for that person or that household. All we really look for then is, date of birth probably isn't going to change unless it was, entered incorrectly. Maybe they switched numbers around, or they got the wrong month or something, or they didn't know exactly which date it was. With most of the demographics, they don't change. But when you get to some of the others, like the homeless history, those may have changed since the last time. So because it's a shared system, all the end user has to do, if this is an existing record that's coming through, is go through this and see, is the information that was previously reported still correct? Or do they need to update some of it? So the great part about this is, since the data is shared, we get that continuous story. We don't have to repeat everything and go back through it. It's just verifying it and updating it if it's not correct. So now we have what are called the project-specific data elements. Again, this is from the HUD standards. So these are data elements that the federal partners, the various partners, require for some programs, for some funding streams. Not all projects use these, but for the most part, these are the ones that we generally push out to all of our participating agencies because they are generally very basic sets of information. There are additional specific data elements for VA-funded, SSVF-specific, or for PATH-funded projects. So there are some very specific ones, but these are kind of the common ones that we see. And so this gives us additional information that is verified and updated at point of entry, and then also at maybe an annual assessment or an update, and then also at exit to see what their situation is. So this collects income information. So income, we have 15 different types of income sources that can be collected. And this allows us to look at the amount of income that they are receiving. So if they're getting earned income, if they're getting SSI or SSDI, all of that information is collected in here. And so it really gives us a great way to look at how much income does someone have? What is their status with that? Are they gaining income? Are they losing income? Are they maintaining it? So it gives us that information. And the nice thing with these are, because we have so many sources and this changes a lot, our vendor has set it up to where an end user can see that history very easily to see, okay, well, they had this much at this point and maybe they lost some or they gained some. It really does show that nice full picture for that case manager that's working with them. We also have non-cash benefits, which again allow us to record the amount of that benefit. So if they're receiving something like WIC or food stamps, we can actually put in that amount. So it can help with case planning. It can help with that information as they move forward. And it's a way for this information to be updated throughout an enrollment. So if they have something at entry and then they gain some by the time they're discharged, we can record that, we can report on that, we can see what's happening with those clients. If you can go back real quick, Cindy, go back to the one slide right before, yeah. So on the slide, we also have disabilities. Now, we generally do not collect diagnosis information, we just collect the basic categories. And you can see that these are actually split out because the guidance changes with some of these. Some of them have additional guidance because of the different types of funders that may be involved with HMIS, or whether or not that disability information may change over time. So there are things like the drug and alcohol use issues that can be collected in HMIS, and those obviously with treatment and care could change. So there's separate guidance for some of those, whereas others like chronic health conditions may not change necessarily. So these are separated out specifically because HUD does provide specific guidance for each one and wants to provide a little more clarity on what they mean when they talk about a physical disability versus a developmental disability versus a chronic health condition. The only really specific diagnosis that's included on here is the HIV/AIDS one, and that is primarily because the housing opportunities with persons with AIDS is a funding stream that can use HMIS, so that one needs to be separated out for eligibility purposes. But this allows us to track that information. The one thing I wanted to point out with this too is I'd mentioned the HUD standards updates. And so on this is the existing standards. We have mental health problem, and in the standards, the older standards, it was listed as substance abuse problems. The one major change HUD is doing starting in October is they spent a lot of time getting information about improving the language that's used, trying to prevent stigmatizing language, or creating more inclusive ways to incorporate the data. And so instead of saying mental health problem, I believe the change is mental health disorder, and it'll be substance use disorder too. They're trying to get away from some of that more stigmatizing language and really trying to improve that. And they're doing that with a lot of input from local communities as well. So sometimes HUD is very slow to implement changes, but they are actively working on it. We work with a lot of great people at HUD that do this, and they are really open to recommendations and suggestions, which we greatly appreciate. And the one other thing I wanted to add too before we move on to the reporting is also HMIS is customizable. We can add additional questions to it. It's not something that's always done, but we do have some providers that have some very specific funder questions that they need to report on, and so we can make changes. With the HUD standards, we generally have to leave those as is because changing them creates issues in our reports. But with the database itself, we can add additional questions. So if people are looking to collect information, maybe they collect it in an Excel spreadsheet separate from their HMIS data, we can always incorporate it, and we're happy to look into how we can incorporate some of those other data elements. And anything that you collect in HMIS, we can pull out, we can report out on it. So putting the information in there means that we have a chance to report out on it and help you with counts and outcomes, whatever you need to do for your funders. So now that I've talked about some of the basic data elements and the entry exits, I wanted to talk about some of the common reporting metrics that are used for our federal reports and local reports, and the different ways that they can be defined and kind of what they mean. So again, we're going to start with entry exits because, like I said, they are the backbone to basically most of our reporting because it's such a great thing to track that enrollment and to show who is in a project, when are they active during the reporting period. It really gives us that great picture. So from the entry exits, we can look at who was enrolled, when were they enrolled, how long were they enrolled, how many new enrollments did we see into a project or a project type or the system during a month or a year or a quarter. Where are people exiting to? Are they exiting to homelessness? Are they exiting to shelter? It gives us that information. And again, all of those data elements that we collect can also be reported on. So we can report on when someone comes into shelter, what was their prior living situation? Who's coming into shelter with a disability or without any income or entering with some other situation that we want to look at? If we want to look at the equity of who is being served in projects, we can look at that. So that entry exit gives us that information and again allows us to track some of those changes over time. So with newly homeless, this is an interesting one that we get a lot of discussion about. People talk about this a lot. There are so many ways to define this that the definition is really important on this one. And so generally it is looking at someone enters a literal homeless project like street outreach, emergency shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing. Or you could even look at, without any of those interventions, they're going right into rapid rehousing because they got, connected to coordinated entry and maybe a church helped pay for a hotel that doesn't enter into HMIS or something. So there are some nuances to that, but generally we're looking at people entering literally homeless projects and then they haven't had activity in HMIS before that based on the definition. And so the common things that we see are brand new clients in HMIS with no previous activity. When was their record created? That is newly homeless. We also see clients that have been in HMIS but haven't been in shelter or safe haven or street outreach ever before that entry. Or the HUD metric is looking at that first entry. Have they had activity in the last 24 months? If they have, then they would not be newly homeless. If they don't show up in HMIS for two years before that entry date, HUD would consider them to be newly homeless. And that is one of the measures on the system performance measures. And so there are a lot of different ways we can look at it, but it really comes back to this is where that entry exit is really important because we can look at when are they entering a project, when are they getting connected to case management, but also when did they last get any kind of service in HMIS. So this one definitely plays back into that entry exit. And then we also have length of stay. Length of stay is one of the easiest, kind of the most basic measures that we look at, but it's actually a lot more complicated than people might originally think. And so length of stay is basically from that entry date to that exit date, how many days, how many months, whatever that unit of measure you want to look at. We could do minutes, seconds. If someone really wanted to know how many seconds someone is in shelter, we could do that. But length of stay can be done in different ways, and it often is based on the report. So when you look at the system, we will report on length of homelessness, length of stay, across all of our literally homeless projects for a single client. So if a client goes from street outreach to emergency shelter to safe haven, and then into permanent supportive housing, all of those days that they spent in those homeless projects from street outreach to safe haven would be counted. It's going to be that sum of how many days were they in these projects across the system. Then you can do it by project type. How many days is a client in emergency shelter? If they stay in 2 different shelters for 30 days each, it would be looking at this client used shelter for 60 days during the reporting period. Then we can also do it by project. So that same client that was in shelter A and shelter B for 30 days each stayed in those 2 shelters for 30 days each. And so we'd be looking at that project level. And then lastly, we can also look at just for each enrollment. So if a client is in shelter 4 times, we don't care about that frequency. We're looking at how long were they in shelter each time they were in there. So even though this is a very basic one, there are a lot of ways we can actually look at it depending on the story we want to tell, what we're trying to measure, and what our purpose is for that report. The last one on this slide is our exits to permanent housing. And this is really comes down to when someone leaves a project, where are they going? We have several dozen different exit destinations. HUD has done a great job of trying to account for almost every type of situation. And we have a lot of kind of broad ones that people can pick from. So some examples of our permanent destinations are rental by client with a subsidy. So with a voucher or with rapid rehousing, or rental by client without any subsidy at all. We also have permanent supportive housing. So if they're going into a permanent supportive housing project and that is their exit destination, then that would be one that we pick. And then also if we, if we were able to reunite someone with family or friends and get them to stay there on a permanent basis, we can also select that. So there are a lot of different options for this one. And there are different ways to look at it again, because we can also look at it as for every enrollment, where did they go? But sometimes the better one is, and this is what HUD uses and what we use locally for some of our reports, is at the last exit during that year, where did the client go? Because they may leave 7 programs or 7 different enrollments throughout the year. But maybe what we really care about is what was that last exit, because that may be the final one before they, they leave the system and don't re-enter homelessness. So there are still different ways to look at it. And so the kind of the key with some of these metrics is really they're pretty simple, but we can do a lot of different things with them based on, again, the story we want to tell or what we're trying to look at. Do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So then we have some others that are, again, some of the common measures. And so changes in income. And this could really, this one is important because we can do a lot of things with income. But I'd also say changes in status are just a common one too. Someone may enter a project without insurance and get health insurance when they exit. That would be a change we could report on. Income is really interesting because, again, we can do a lot with it. And so income is collected at entry. We would see updates during their enrollment if they have any, and then whatever that income was when they are discharged from the project. And so we can report on what that change was, if there was any, if they increased income, if they maintained it, if they lost it, maybe they didn't have income at all through that entire enrollment. We can actually report on that. And we can do a little more with drilling down on that too. So because we collect all of those different income sources, we could actually look at whether clients are increasing employment income. Maybe they gained employment during their enrollment and we want to show that work. We could show changes in SSI or SSDI or other forms of income throughout the enrollment. And so a lot of the time what we look at we break out those categories because a change in their employment income may lead to a change into other non-employment forms of income. But we want to show that work that was done. They still gained that employment and that was good. That's a great thing that we want to see. So we can look at the overall change, but if they have $500 in one income at entry, they lose that during because they gained $500 in employment income, it would show that client didn't have any changes. But if we show employment income, we would see that increase. And so sometimes that extra level of detail with this metric really gives us a great idea of what's happening. As we're looking at workforce development and connecting people to employment resources and trying to get them access to SSI or SSDI, being able to show specific changes at that level of income, that source of income, really does go a long way to showing what's happening in our community. The next one is returns to homelessness, or essentially after they exit to permanent housing, do they re-enter a literal homeless project at some point in the future? So if someone exits to rental by client without subsidy and then they show up in an emergency shelter 6 months later, that would be considered to be a return. Now this one's pretty straightforward because it just requires that exit to permanent housing and then some subsequent return to a project that requires homelessness as a part of entry or is designed to serve homeless clients. But there are still some nuances to this. And so date range does really matter. So with date range, if we're looking at 12, or if we're going to see returns from a project within 12 months, the general rule of thumb is you need to add 12 months to your reporting period because you want to account for all of the possible time for those clients to return. And so let's say we wanted to look at exits from fiscal year 2020 or from calendar year 2020, and then we're going to see who returns in 12 months. Well, if that individual or household exits to permanent housing on December 31st, 2020, and we run the report through the end of that year, we can't see them return unless they return that same day. We would want to look all the way to December 31st, 2021 to see if they return. So if we ran that report today, they may not return because there isn't enough time to account for that 12 months. So returns can be very simple, but to really capture the full amount of information does usually require a larger than expected or larger than usual time frame to really do it, to get that full picture, because shortening that time frame can just shorten the amount of time for people to return, and it doesn't give you an incorrect picture, it just gives you an incomplete picture. So this is one that can take long date ranges to really get that good picture, and is really something that should be done almost retroactively, looking after the fact, what is that outcome. And then finally, we look at chronically homeless. Now, chronically homeless isn't always a metric as far as, are people chronically homeless? How, it's not an outcome. It is a kind of a precursor. So chronically homeless is a part of eligibility for some permanent supportive housing projects, for other projects that are designed to serve those that are chronically homeless. Obviously, we need to know that if they're going into that project. So it's an important thing to report on. But the other thing is that chronically homeless is a great way to see who is being served and the needs, because chronically homeless means they have reported a disability. And it goes back to those categories that we talked about previously. It also means that they have been homeless. And there are two different ways they can be homeless to be chronically homeless. So the one is continuous homelessness. They've been continuously homeless for 365 days or longer. And that can, it could be 1 year, it could be 2 years, it could be 10 years, it can be any length of continuous homelessness that's not broken up by even a short stint of longer than a week in a rental that they were staying at. So there's that continuous homelessness, and then there's also kind of a cyclical version where in the last 3 years they've been homeless 4 or more episodes that total a total of 12 months or longer in that 3-year period. So there are kind of two ways we can look at it. They're still classified the same, but there are two ways they can meet that requirement. But this also goes into show not just eligibility, but it can also show need. If we have people that are coming in that are chronically homeless, they are going to probably have higher needs than someone that isn't, someone that's newly homeless. And so it does help us get a better picture of who is being served and the challenges that the case manager may need to look at addressing with that person to get them, stably housed and move them out of homelessness in the future. So the last part of the kind of the reporting aspect, the data aspect of HMIS I want to touch on is these services. So we've already talked about entry exits. This tracks our enrollment. Services is the opposite. Services tracks the specific acts or items provided to those being served by the project. So we have a list of the most common services that we see in HMIS. So things like case management, the rent, utility deposit or payment assistance. If someone is being placed into a hotel, that can also be tracked. If we're providing traveler's aid to get them relocated to stay with family or friends, or if we are, trying to get someone, able to get to work, they need a bus pass or they need some gas money to go to that job interview, those can be collected. Basic needs like food, some of the personal grooming supplies can also be tracked. The services uses the AIRS taxonomy, which is primarily designed for use by information and referral services, so 211s, but a lot of 211s collaborate with HMISs, and so HMIS uses the AIRS taxonomy because it's such a great broad set of service codes, and then HMIS vendors don't have to try to recreate it, HUD doesn't have to try to recreate it. And the AIRS taxonomy has over 10,000 different codes that can be used, so we can generally find something to match any service an agency is providing. It may not specifically match that name, but we can provide something that you can use to collect that information and track it. And inside that service, we can track the start and end date. So if you're providing that service once, you'd have the same start and end date. If you are providing a service that maybe is a 7-day enrollment or a 7-day hotel stay, you can actually track that start and end date for that service if you want to show this service was provided over this period of days. It also tells us If you are using a funding source and you want to track that in HMIS, you can add that funding source to that service. And so you can then report and say, this many rental payment services were provided out of social action funding or out of ESG or whatever that funding stream is that you're using for that. And along with that funding, you can actually input the cost of that service. So if you're doing rent payment assistance, you can put in what that check was cut for. You can put in what the deposit was cut for. You can do that. And then we also have some providers that use that funding amount for their own reconciliation purposes. So they just want to make sure that what they have in QuickBooks or something else matches what's in HMIS. Or if they're providing those bulk services, like if they are a soup kitchen and they're tracking all of their meals, and they want to track how much they're spending on those meals each day, just so they can help with budgeting and planning purposes. Like, it can be set up for different ways based on what that provider needs. But these are a way to show, again, that specific service that's being done. And so it is kind of an extra step from that entry exit, but some providers do, or some funders do require it. And it's also just a great way to show all of the work that our end users are doing. We have some end users or some clients that get hundreds of services, and it's a really great way to track and show this is where they have been. If we're looking for someone for a coordinated entry and maybe their phone got disconnected, but we're seeing that service history, we can say, okay, maybe they've actually stopped at the soup kitchen, or they have been at this service center, and maybe that would be a way to kind of make that connection. So outside of just being a great way for agencies to use that information internally, it's also a great way to see all of the things that the client has received in the past, to see what else can we help with, what else can we do? Can we find them somewhere if we're trying to get them into a permanent housing intervention? So services do offer a lot of additional, very specific information that aren't just a part of the kind of the standard workflows. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ganael.
All right, so let's talk about some of the tools you can find in HMIS. So we have two major modules in HMIS. That would be Client Point and Shelter Point, which is changing very soon to Unit Manager, but the essence will still be the same. Shelter Point is where you'd want to capture all of the clients who are staying at a shelter. And Client Point, this is where most, I want to say, case managers go to create their their entries, capture their services, and so on. So this is kind of a screenshot of what Client Point looks like when you first click the button there on the top left, if you're able to see that. So it pops open this client search page, and this is where you can look for clients either via first and last name or by social security number. There's also a search bar on the top right, this white search bar. That's where you can put the HMIS ID number. If you already have that, if you're consistently working with the same client and you pretty much just either memorize their ID number because you've been working with them for so long, that's where you could search via ID number. And this is what the client profile will look like when you find the profile, you click on their name, and then you come to this summary screen where it gives you some basic demographics. Here you can see their date of birth, social, gender, race, veteran status, and a little bit below you can see all of the different release of informations in HMIS for the different providers that they're working with. And on the right side, you can see some of those entry exits that Brian spoke about earlier. This is a little demo of what the shelter point looks like. Again, this is part of our training site, but here you can see who at a glance is staying in what particular bed, when they checked in, there's that date in on the left-hand side there. This also shows you what beds look like when they're held. So if you get a referral from someone, they're saying that the client's heading over to your shelter pretty soon, you can click that blue hold button and it turns into a red held button that way no one can check them into that bed accidentally. And to check them into a held bed, you just click on held and it turns it back into a blue hold button, and you can just check that person in. And I'll hand that over to Brian.
Okay, so along with Client Point and Shelter Point, HMIS also has a number of reporting tools. We currently have 3 different reporting tools that are available for different purposes. So the first one is the canned HMIS reports. These are reports that are generally published for a specific reason. Some of them are vendor published based on our vendor's view of kind of what would be useful. And the vendor that we use has been around since 2004. And so they have been kind of using and revising some of these reports for different purposes. And then others of these canned reports are designed for some of those specific federal programs that we talked about, like ESG or SSVF or PATH. So these are often done for a specific reason. And the canned reports have some great tools available for all of our end users to use. And so we have a report like the client served report that shows us all of the different services, the funding sources of those services, the funding amounts, and then also the demographics of those clients being served. This is not one that is designed for a specific federal program. It's designed by WellSky, our vendor, and it's maintained because it's really a great report for people to use to make sure, are all of my services in there? Do the demographics, the household makeup of my clients that are receiving those services look correct? Do I have my funding sources in there? And it shows that funding so you can look and use it for reconciliation purposes. We have some of those federal program reports like the COC APR and the ESG CAPER. As the names indicate, the APR is used for HUD-funded COC projects that receive money through the COC NOFA, and the APR or the CAPER is used by emergency solutions grants, regardless of whether it's coming from, what level or what agency that money is passing through. All ESG recipients would be using this report for their uploads. The federal reports that are designed as canned reports, like the APR and the CAPER, are usually designed to give you a CSV file that you can use as a direct upload to a HUD or VA or other repository. The one major change we are seeing in HMIS is that instead of requiring an agency to go in and manually type in numbers into a dozen or more fields and add in everything manually, HUD is moving towards direct exports and uploads from HMIS. And so that's why these reports are published in this manner, because it allows for that CSV that meets HUD specifications. And so a lot of these reports are designed for specific purposes. So the APR is specifically designed based on HUD specifications for the COC funded projects, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful for anyone else. A lot of these reports show a mixture of data quality and then also performance outcomes. So we'll look at an APR on the training side a little later. It shows you error rates for some of the data elements. It also shows us things like increases in income, successful exits to permanent housing, different outcomes like that based on what HUD is asking for. And again, these reports are also available to all of our end users. And so even if it's not one that you need to run for your funder, you still have access to it. Some of them may not work for your specific project. So some of the more specific ones like the SSVF and PATH reports only work for those funded projects, but any project can run an APR and CAPER as long as they are using entry exits. And so these really are great tools to do some data quality and some outcome checks. The nice thing with the canned reports too is that they actually use live data. So if I make changes to a client's record today, within a few minutes, that information will be updated the next time I run an APR or a CAPER or a client served report. So I don't have to wait longer for that information to show up. It is live. The one downside to these reports are because they are created for certain purposes, they are created to those federal specifications or our vendor specifications, and HMIS staff does not have access to make changes or tweaks. So if the APR includes everything you need, but maybe one thing, we can't add it to that report, but we do have opportunities to do our own custom reporting, which I have on the next slide. So in HMIS, we currently have two advanced reporting tools. One is being phased out and the other one is being implemented currently. So the first tool is called ART, or the Advanced Reporting Tool, which is a very creative name. I'm sure our vendors took a lot of time to shop that name around before they landed on it, but it's a version of SAP Business Objects. It is an older version of Business Objects. SAP has stopped support for that one, and it also requires Java, which is being phased out of basically every browser. So it has an end of life. It is being phased out because it's no longer being supported, and it is a dated tool. We are getting ClickSense, which our vendor WellSky is currently working with the ClickSense vendor called Click to implement. They're working through some setup to match like our security model and our visibility models in HMIS. But the nice thing is that these are tools that are directly implemented into our database. So you're not downloading an extra program on your computer. You don't have to do anything like that. It's directly connected to the database. And all you have to do is click on a button to access it. It opens it up in a new window, and it lets you manage stuff outside of it. But there are some limits to it too. So the big limit to the advanced reporting tools is that they do not utilize that live data. They actually work off of a snapshot of the database that's built every night. So if you are using one of these for a grant and your due date's coming up, you want to make sure you get all of your corrections in by the day before it's the due date. That way you can run the report the next day and make sure everything is correct. And it's done that way because if you're working on building a custom report, you don't want to be working on data that's constantly changing. That would make it very difficult to do a lot of quality assurance on it. So it is set up that way for a reason. But it does limit if you are trying to hurry up and get corrections in before you run a report for a funder. The advantage of these tools are that you can do a lot with them. ART is dated. It looks a little more like Excel spreadsheets. Some very, very pixelated bar charts are available. Click is a relatively new tool. It's very beautiful. It's designed for visualization. It's designed for presentation. And there's really a lot you can do with that. So we're really excited about getting this tool that we can roll out to our end users to make it available for people to use. We have access to it in a limited capacity to help with this transition between the two reporting tools, but it's still not fully functional. So we're hoping to see that change in the next few months. But the great part about these are where we create all of the custom reports that we do, and they're really capable of doing a fair amount of very detailed work when it comes to the data. And the nice advantage too is that with the canned reports, they are designed for a specific purpose. They're usually kind of limited as far as how much you can drill down into the client level information. With these reports, we can drill down as much as we want. We can make our own distinctions. Even if it's a vendor published report, we can actually make a copy and make changes and add to it. These are fully editable by end users and HMIS staff. So they are a nice tool to use. They're nice to have them available. Again, they also have vendor published reports. ART, although it's going away, still has close to 60 reports published by our vendor. It includes everything from data quality and completeness reports to timeliness reports. The system performance measures come from this. Most of our HIC and PIT data comes out of ART. And then Click is being rolled out, but it currently has over 40 reports that are vendor published as well. So once that tool goes live and is available to all of our end users, it should already have a pretty nice library of reports that agencies can use for a variety of purposes. So they really are a great resource for both the COC for reporting purposes and our partner agencies for their own grant purposes too. And we do build custom reports out of this. So if an agency needs help with reporting, we are happy to assist and look at what we can do to build a report to meet their needs. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ganiel again.
All right, so these are, this is a list of the current trainings that are currently offered. So we have the new user training, Client Point, and the new user training, Shelter Point. Now they all kind of have their own little workflows. Client Point in particular has two main ones, the kind of like the entry exit workflow. And this is for programs who need to create an entry exit to capture that enrollment period into their into that particular project. And there is another workflow called the services only workflow. And that's for clients. I mean, that's for providers who only need to just capture all the services that they are providing to their clients. Shelter Point, similar. Shelter Point is just going through that shelter module that you saw a little bit earlier with the screenshots, and that's where they can check in clients. And that from Shelter Point, that automatically creates an entry in Client Point for them. So they don't have to go into Shelter Point, check them in, and then having to go into Client Point to do additional data entry at that point. Shelter Point kind of handles all of that for them. So for the follow-up training, these are what this is what I go through with our users whenever we finish doing a new user training. I typically schedule a follow-up about a week or two after, give them some time to enter data into HMIS. And this way they actually have some questions from situations they've come across in the last week or two that they didn't quite know what to pick in HMIS depending on the situation. This is where I kind of review some of the entries or some of the services that they've put in, just kind of double check that they're checking all their boxes, offer some assistance if I see any areas of improvement that we can touch on at that training. And then we have the agency administrator training, which covers a lot of different topics. Sometimes this training is really broken out into two just because there's so much to cover. Whether it's help desk tickets, how you submit those, where you can find our most current forms, kind of our expectations of what their role is as an agency administrator, requesting trainings, report trainings, getting them set up with the certification process so that they understand the requirements for that, the different reports you have to run, how you can fix the errors in those reports. So I could really go on and on about what goes into the agency administrator training. But then we have two other types of trainings with reports. So we have the basic report training. And I believe this goes through the kind of the CAN reports, a little bit about troubleshooting, very generic. And then we have the advanced report training. Now, all trainings are pretty much tailored to the agency or project. So if it's, for example, a rapid rehousing program, they have a little bit of a different workflow because they also have to capture the housing move-in date through interim updates. So I do make sure that I go through those steps with them, get them comfortable, helping them understand what you need to capture at entry and when you would need to do an interim update. And follow-ups are done after that initial training to assist the end user with just data quality, data entry, helping them do their data entry efficiently and correctly. So we have an all-day internal data review, and this is a sample agenda that we typically go through. So you can see it starts at 9 and we finish at 4:30. This is where we kind of go through benchmarks, reports, seeing if we can capture any errors, any agencies that may need assistance. And if we go on to the next slide, you can see some of the common data quality errors that come up during the internal data review. Some of the big ones are income, households, housing status, updating entry assessment fields, services, usually the most common ones like case management, hotel, motel. So this is one of the big reasons why we're super excited to have Angela on our team. So that way we can offer a lot more technical assistance than before to really get our data quality shiny. And end users are always I guess, told that they should definitely submit a help desk ticket whenever they come across these errors or something that they can't do. Maybe they don't quite remember because it's been some time since the training. They can always reach out to HMIS through the help desk, and we can help them along and fix the issues that they're having. And along with that, I also created a couple of guides that I kind of hand out to the users, and I let agency administrators know so that they can pass it along to staff. But any areas that I notice that we kind of come up with in our internal data reviews, so like income, for example, in households, I go ahead and I create numerous guides on those topics, usually with like a step-by-step instruction and some explanations of why this particular field is necessary. And we also have some educational videos as well on how to search clients in HMIS. We do have a kind of a duplicate list that I maintain kind of every Monday morning. And usually it's because, one client will go to another agency and introduce themselves with maybe their nickname, and they'll be put into the system under their nickname. And when they go to a different provider that has requirements for, their name, and they have to get a full name, they'll end up creating a new profile. Not too much of a concern. I can always merge them, and there's no data lost at that point. You just end up merging the two profiles. But it does happen. So I've created a couple just tidbit videos on how to avoid that in the future. All right, so the next section is the HMIS showcase. And I hope you're all excited as much as we are about the slide here. So let me go ahead and I will start sharing my screen, and we'll jump right into the demo. I was logged in earlier, but unfortunately Service Point doesn't like it when you don't do anything for a long period of time. So share screen. Okay. Hopefully you're all able to see the training site. Perfect. I'll zoom in just a bit here so we can see a little bit more. So when a user logs into Service Point, this is the screen, the very first screen that they will see. On the center, we have some system news. So this is news that we, HMIS, send out to them, usually with some tidbits, important information. If I release a new guide, I'd let them know that it's available so that they can go to the help desk. If we make any changes to our release of information forms, I always put out a system news just to let them know that, a new form is available, scrap the old ones, please start using the new ones as soon as possible. But over here on the left side, we're going to go into Client Point. This is where a lot of the data entry kind of goes into here. So we can click Client Point, and you'll see that familiar green client search page from before. And this is where you can search for the client by first or last name or social, or a combination of social and date of birth if the user has that information. On the top right-hand side here, there is that global search bar where you can search via client ID. And at the very bottom here, there's also another section. So you can search, if you're on the home screen when you first log in, you can come right up here at the top, click search, or if you don't know that information, you can always come into Client Point and search by name. I'll go ahead into client 116 here, and we'll click submit. Okay, so we are in Jennifer Test's profile. If you recall from the screenshot, this is the same profile you were able to see earlier. Now there are no releases of information that you're able to see. So the way the, visibility works in HMIS is that if it's not your agency's release of information, you're not going to see it. So if you see entry exits from other providers, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have an ROI in the system. It just means that you're not able to see it because you're built under a different program. So The way a general data entry person would go into the system and put data in is the first step is they'll always add a release of information. We do have 2 different forms that they're able to choose from up here at the top. Every time you're creating anything in the system, whether it's a release, an entry, a service, even a case note, it will always give you the option of picking a household. So this makes it really easy when you're trying to do data entry for multiple people at the same time. So you don't have to go into Jennifer's profile, put a release of information in, and then go into John's profile and then create a whole different release of information. You can come up here, click the checkbox on the top left-hand side here. It will select everyone in the household. This was a household of maybe 3 or 4 people, and you only needed 2. You could always just pick them individually with the little check mark box on the left of the person's name. And this will create a release of information on both Jennifer and John's profile. So the default provider is what your, I guess your base provider would be. But if you click on the drop down in some users have access to a lot of different programs. So you can see this profile that I'm under right now has access to some coordinated entry programs. We're going to stick to the demo project here. The release granted, they're always going to be picking no here. The start date is automatically set to today's date, but you can definitely backdate yourself if you're putting information in, from a date prior. And the end date depends on which documentation. I mentioned earlier, we have 2 separate forms for the release of information. So this first one up here is the informed consent. That one's the blanket, the blanket form. So that's the client agreeing to all their information being shared to all of our providers. The second option is the more specific one. So the client, maybe they're not comfortable sharing their entries with another agency, or maybe they don't want to share their disabilities or their services. They can pick the second option, and then we have the verbal consent, which is mostly reserved for street outreach and 211. So I'll go ahead and pick the informed consent here. That one has an expiration of 3 years. So I'll go ahead and put 6/4/2024. And the witness would be the user's name at that point. And then they'll click save. I just want to show you real quick here. So up here at the top, we have a release of information. It says none. Once I click save, it'll say that it ends on 6/4/2024. And when it's expiring soon, it will say expiring soon if the release is expiring tomorrow. So it's kind of a prompt just to let you know that, okay, the release is expiring soon and you want to make sure you get the client to sign a new one. So over here on the right side, we have entry exits, the backbone of a lot of our reports. We can click add entry exit here. Again, similar to before, we can pick the whole household in this scenario. The project type, you'll see we have a lot of different options here, and this is relating to the funding source. We have HUD, PATH, RI, and so on. Go ahead and stick with basic for this demo, and we'll click save and continue. This is what it looks like when you pick the wrong entry type. And this is something I go through a lot with our users. And a lot of times I'll find that in audits, whenever we try to help them in the follow-ups, is that they'll pick the wrong project type and then they're not quite sure how to proceed at that point. So I always go through and show them that you can always come up here, try a couple different ones, click update, and eventually you'll get the right one, and then they'll start remembering at that point. This is where the entry assessment is located. So this is where all of our universal data element fields are located. And you'll see a little bar on the left side. Sometimes it's green, sometimes it's red. It just shows you how current the information is. So if it's red, it means the information was put in a long time ago, which isn't a bad thing. Some folks look at red and they'll think that that's an error, but that's not necessarily the case. Red just means that it was put in a long time ago. And a lot of the first couple fields, date of birth, race, and so on, those typically aren't going to be changing. So it makes sense a lot of times if the client's been in the system for several years that these fields are red. because there's really no need to change them unless there was an error in the initial intake. But we have that relationships ahead of household question. This was one of our common data quality errors that we identify in our internal data review. Just making sure that there's only one head of household per household. So we can scroll down, we see some of the homeless criteria questions. We have the housing status. This is where you can pick if the client is categorized as homeless or at imminent risk of losing housing. Client location in HMIS, most of them will be FL 502. Their prior living situation, these are the homeless criteria questions that we covered a little bit earlier, a couple slides ago. The length of stay, for how long did they stay at that prior living situation for, the approximate date homelessness started. This one is kind of a tricky field for some of our users, so we tend to go through some scenarios. If the client says, yeah, I've been maybe sleeping in my car the last 2 weeks, and maybe the last 2 days I stayed at a friend's house, just kind of explaining to them that staying at their friends for 2 days is not enough of a break for their approximate date of homelessness to start over. There has to be a break, I believe, of 7 or more days. So in that situation that I just mentioned, the approximate date homeless would have been 2 weeks prior. And regardless, the number of times the client's been in streets, shelter, or safe haven in the last 3 years, and the total number of months homeless in the last 3 years. Again, these are that chronically homeless, those chronically homeless criteria questions. Then following on, we have that domestic violence victim survivor question, which is just a simple yes or no. And if it's yes, they just have to answer the next 2 questions, just highlighting when the experience was and if they are currently fleeing. Moving down, we'll see the housing move-in date field. This is where you can put in if the client was housed. Typically, this is done at an interim update, not the initial intake, because that's the point where they kind of just do the intake assessment, get a little bit of a background, help them get settled, and then later on, they're able to find a rental unit for them. Moving past the housing move-in date section, we'll see some of the project-specific data elements highlighted earlier where we have the income options. So this is where the user would be updating the income. I'm going to click on HUD verification here just to show you all the different types, the different sources of income that we can capture in HMIS. So you'll see earned income, child support, SSDI, SSI, TANF. We have a lot of other different types of options as well. This is the screen that the user would be able to update income on. Moving down to this bottom field here, the non-cash benefits. Every single the HUD verification section, they always have a yes or no, just to clarify, is the client receiving this non-cash benefit? And if you pick no, then the information that is in here, this HUD verification section, would need to match this field right here. And again, I'll click on HUD verification so you can see a couple of the types of non-cash benefits that they can have. Food stamps, WIC, we have the TANF child care services, other TANF services. That and move on down to health insurance. Now, this is where they are able to capture that health insurance information. Again, the user always wants to make sure that they're being consistent with what they're picking. So if they're stating no up here that the client is not receiving health insurance, then they want to make sure that in here, none of the health insurance options say yes. So we can click on HUD verification here. They all say no, so that makes sense. And here we have the options: Medicaid, Medicare, VA services, private health insurance. The county blue card does not fall under these categories. They will fall under other. And moving on down to the disabilities here. This is where you're able to capture that particular client's disability here. Again, I'll click on HUD verification just so we can see the different options, alcohol abuse, both alcohol and drug abuse, and so on. Again, Brian did mention that they are changing some of the language on this just so that we don't have, the words like problem on this particular field. You'll see this particular client is listed as having a mental health problem. And if that needs to be updated, then the user can update that field from this screen right here. And last but not least, we have the client information section. So this is where you can record, a phone number for a client, maybe an email address. This is especially useful for clients who are enrolled in coordinated entry. Someone will do a BI SPDAT on them. They'll be enrolled in coordinated entry, and then it's time for coordinated entry to reach out to that particular client. They'll come into the client's profile, scroll down to the client's information section, and they'll be able to see the different phone numbers that the client has had, and they can try these phone numbers to see if they're able to reach them. And if not, they can always go through to the client's, entry section just to see, okay, are they staying at a shelter? Maybe I can reach out to the shelter to get in contact with them, or they'll see that there's maybe visiting a soup kitchen on a daily basis. Then they're able to kind of take a look at that and kind of guesstimate when the next time the client will be going to the soup kitchen. Maybe they can cash them at that time, or they'll reach out to that particular provider just to say, hey, I'm trying to contact this particular client. Can you let me know the next time they come in, or kind of just give them my phone number so that they can reach out to me, and so on. And then we can also capture landlord information and emergency contact information. And at that point, they'll click Save and Exit. And due to the scrolling, it will drop you off at the very bottom of the page. But if you scroll up back to what we could see earlier, you'll be able to see that this client was enrolled into this program here on today's date. Now, at this point, what users can do while the client is enrolled is, add different services for that client during the enrollment period. So if they're offering a lot of case management services, they can do that down here under the services section. They could always add service here, click that button. Again, the very first thing you can pick is a household member. So users initially just prompted to, okay, yeah, I want to make sure I don't forget John when I do data entry for this particular household. The start date is automatically set to today's date, but the user can backdate the information if you're trying to put in a service from yesterday or 2 days ago. The end date for most of our services, I would say, is kind of the same for the start date, unless it's a shelter. So let's say in this case, our service type, we have a couple of different options here. We have case management, homeless motel voucher, pick a motel voucher, just so we can see the financial component of some services. So let's say we're paying for a motel for 1 day for the client to stay in before they can go into a shelter. We can put the end date to be the same date here. It will automatically fill in the end time to be, I want to say noon. And the time does not matter too much as long as the dates line up. So we'll click Save and Continue there. And at this point, we have the some service notes section. They can put some very general information here, but definitely train folks not to put in sensitive client information here, no diagnoses or anything like that, just because there's a better area in HMIS called the case notes. That keeps your case notes pretty private, so that in that case, only people from your agency can see those case notes. So that way you don't have to provide that kind of specific information in here in the services. Moving on down, you'll see the service costs, and this is where you'd want to put the dollar amount, for example, for the particular stay in that motel. So we're only paying for 1 day, so we'll put 1 day here. If we're paying for maybe a weekend, we'd put 3, and the total cost of units. So this will be how much was paid for that particular motel day. Just go ahead and put 60 here. All right. And at this point, we can scroll down to the bottom of the page, and this is something that's done on all services. This is kind of a requirement to make sure that this service shows up on the reports, is putting the need status to say closed. And we want to fill out the outcome of need to say fully met. So we put these 2 fields in, and we'll click save and exit. And once we do, it will take us to the services screen for the client. So we'll be able to see all the other services that were provided to this client. But right now there's only 1 service, and we can see the total cost of units here. We can see the dates. So this is kind of where users can double check with themselves. Okay, yes, that is the 60. If maybe they mistyped and put a 7 instead of a 6, and they'll be able to see at a glance that it was incorrect, and they can come back into the service by clicking the pencil to make any modifications. And I'll click back onto the client information tab here. So we have the services tabs and the client information tab. And here, I just want to show a little bit about when you're exiting a client from that particular program. You'll come up here to the summary page, and you'll click the pencil next to exit date. And from here, we'll click the pencil. Again, it gives us, at the very top, we'll pick that household number just to be consistent. We'll have an exit date for the client, whenever they exited the program. The reason for leaving, we have a lot of different options in HMIS, and so many options that really one of them will at least fit whatever situation you're in. So you're never having to pick, other or anything like that. So for example, we'll just pick completed program here. And this is our destination section. And this is where you can pick where the client will be going when they're exited to that program. So let me scroll down and just to show you some of the permanent and temporary permanent housing situations that Brian spoke about earlier. We have that staying or living with family permanently or friends permanently. If we scroll down a little bit more here, we'll see rental by client with no ongoing housing subsidy. That's what I'll choose here. And at this point, again, we have a note section here. Again, always want to make sure that the user is being pretty vague in this section. I'll go ahead and click save and continue. And this is where we can capture, again, incomes. You're only going to see the project specific data elements on the exit assessment. You won't see any of the UDEs, but this is where, we're able to capture, increases in income, decreases in income. You're able to capture that into updates as well. But again, exiting just to see when the client entered your program, they were making this amount. By the time they exited, they increased. That's one of the outcomes we want to see, or if they maintained, or if they decreased. And again, we have the non-cash benefits, health insurance and disabilities, where you can update that information as well. And if there were any updates to the client information section, the user is able to do that from this screen as well. And we'll click save and exit. And again, we scrolled a bit here, so we have to scroll back up to the screen. But here you can see that the client was entered in this program on this date and exited on that date as well. And this is usually what the workflow looks like for users, just putting in the release, enrolling the client in the program. While they're enrolled, adding however many services you're supposed to add at that point, and then exiting them from that program. And just make sure here we have bit of time here. We're hoping to show a bit of the APR section, and I'll go into the little report side. This will show you a lot of the provider reports that you can choose from, the client serve report, referrals, service transactions. I'll go ahead and click on the COC APR. And if we want to go ahead and steer Brian, I'll go ahead and I'll keep sharing my screen, just kind of let me know what to click on and show.
Well, actually, Ganael, I think that we're going to have to go to questions at this point. Unfortunately, we're running close out of time.
Time flew by.
Yes, exactly. So maybe this will be HMIS 102. Thank you. So Ganael, there was one question that was asked, and that was about the G next to the field for goals. Did you want to explain a little bit about that, what that means?
Yes, so in HMIS, the user is able to set up a goal for themselves, and it will show up on their dashboard as a follow-up. So when they click on that goal, they're able to set a date, which is kind of a reminder for themselves that, they need to either reach out to the client to do an update, or, that's when they need to do an annual assessment on that particular field. And it will show up on the client's dashboard under the follow-up list section on the right-hand side of that dashboard. And at that point, when it has a time remaining section, so when it comes due, it'll kind of pop in red. The word due is going to turn red, and they'll be able to click the client ID, and it will take them to that field for them to either update or add a case note or make any changes that they need to make.
Great. So now we're going to open up the floor for anyone who has questions. Please feel free to ask staff at this time. If anyone has any questions, I know it's a lot to take in one sitting. We apologize. But like I said, we already know that we have to do a HMIS 102. No questions, anyone? I know that a point was made about the acronyms being, using acronyms. We're going to need to be a little bit more mindful, like APR stands for Annual Performance Report. LSA, Brian, you can say it better than I can. So there's a lot of acronyms that are used through HUD, and we are working on actually a dictionary in our policy and procedure manual to try to help folks with those acronyms as well, because it is a lot. And, in human services, acronyms are used very frequently. So we're mindful of that. We are working on a glossary of definitions for acronyms. If no one else has any questions, I guess we'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to kind of close this out and say thank you to HLA staff for putting this together. I think we've kind of changed the way we've done the board meetings, and I think having these information sessions are critical to informing the board members and staff, and the public at large on these very important topics. And I know we can get more done during our actual board meeting. So thank you for Amy for coming up with this idea, and thank you for HLA staff. I also want to thank all of our board members who are present. Ton of information. Now you can see all the stuff that HLA staff and our providers, Amy mentioned this in the beginning, HMIS is always a topic, and data is always a topic of hot discussion. And you can see this kind of gives us under the hood view of everything that our providers, all the data input, everything they go through to get us the numbers that we're reviewing a lot of the times at the board meeting. So I just wanted to do a quick wrap up. Thank everybody for being here. For spending your time, your Fridays with us, and we will see you at the next board meeting. So thanks. Have a great evening and weekend.
Everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.